that is, our nation, was a break. It was the first defeat of the British Empire in every sense of the word, and that had to be followed up with an economic system that allowed actual freedom. What is freedom if you're starving or freezing or dying of disease or in war? That is not freedom. FDR was very clear about that, and he said these freedoms are for everyone in the world, not to be quote unquote imposed, as if you can impose freedom at the point of a gun, but that the United States had to embody these principles. So there is some actually very major news today, which is not what's all over the media, which is the repeal of R v. Wade by the Supreme Court, but the fact that you have major nations making new agreements, including new means of trade, new currency agreements and trade agreements, which they have been forced to do by the U.S. sanctions against Russia and against so many countries, and because their governments are actually committed to the survival and well-being of their people. And I will tell you that Ned Price of the State Department is lying and saying that nothing of significance has happened. The BRICS nations have been meeting in the last 2 days. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These nations alone are a very large part of the world's population. If they are making significant trade and currency agreements, this is something that people absolutely should know about. And I think it would give the American people a great sense of hope, actually, to know that everyone on the planet is not going along with the Great Reset, green ideology, the Malthusian outlook of overpopulation, which is imposed on us by the mainstream press and everybody else. The other thing I just really want to stress, because they keep trying to say in the news that somehow Ukraine is going to win a war against Russia, that is not happening. Russia is absolutely winning. The question is, what do you do at the end of that? And that is why what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed in terms of a new security architecture, and what came out of the conference, a proposal for a new Bretton Woods conference, is absolutely critical. And a Bretton Woods along the lines of what FDR intended, not like we had before, which was certainly better than the system now, but which was did not really level the playing field as FDR intended. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, because of his death, became tools of colonial oppression as opposed to instruments of credit for every nation to be allowed its full independence through economic development. What we're going to talk about tonight with the historian for my campaign, Robert Wesser, is some of the history of the United States, the history of the West Point Military Academy, which also happens to be in the state of New York, so it's something very important for New Yorkers to know about. And as part of an effort of my campaign this year and going forward, that by the time of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, we should have returned to something that would be recognizable by George Washington or Alexander Hamilton. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Wesser.
Okay, thank you, Diane. And what I want to do, get our slides up here. So we're going to talk about the an absolutely revolutionary, as most of what the early American Republic institutions were, a revolutionary creation of the United States Military Academy, and a revolution in the idea of what a military is supposed to do or what it can do, as opposed to just killing people and fighting wars and stuff like that. And you can see the title, the United States Military Academy and the Scientific and Technological Renaissance that built the nation. And that's what we're gonna go through. Now I want to start with this though, because in many ways, these revolutionary ideas began with this Treaty of Westphalia. Now remember, Europe had gone through decades and decades of horrific religious warfare, bloody warfare, constant wars, and at a certain point it was enough. We have to come up with a different idea of how nations can work together in the common interest of all. And this begged a creation of new ideas on the identity of what a government does and what a human being is, and human development and scientific development. And there exploded out of this a really somewhat of a scientific renaissance, led by, on the left, a gentleman, Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France, who was part of this Treaty of Westphalia process. He set up in 1666 the French Academy of Sciences, and he brought together the greatest minds of Europe at that point: Christian Huygens, the Dutch scientist and physicist, and on the right there, Gottfried Leibniz. And this whole idea of developing a different conception of mankind, a different conception of the power of how a state or a government can be used for physical economic development for the benefit of all. This really became the domain of Leibniz. Leibniz was the Lyndon LaRouche of the time, of the period. This is in the the end of the second half of the 17th century, and Leibniz was into everything. He worked with Peter the Great in Russia to create the Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was involved very much with China. Leibniz's idea was that the future of civilization lay within a connection between the two great centers of what he considered to be civilization. The West, Europe, Western Europe, and then Asia, and Confucian culture in China. And most importantly, from what we're talking about tonight, is he was involved directly with the creation of the early ideas of the American Republic. And that's a whole book that we wrote called How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry, which you can order online and read. It's worth reading. So this was the great experiment, what we did here in the United States. This was 150 years of developing from the time the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the point where we were developing these ideas of progress. And at a certain point, of course, we ran into the British Empire's designs, completely incompatible with these ideas of freedom. And we had the American Revolution. We created the United States of America. And these two gentlemen were the ones that really were tasked to create these new revolutionary institutions. And the first two administrations of George Washington, presidential administrations, working directly with Alexander Hamilton, really began to flesh this out. And Hamilton, of course, came up with these absolutely extraordinary, completely new ideas of banking. What's banking? Is that where a bunch of people hoard money and then exploit everybody else? Well, if you're at the Bank of England, that's what it is. Not with Hamilton's bank. Hamilton's bank was to provide credit so that the government could actually build things to benefit the people as a whole. And during the war, one of the things that they talked about a lot was the creation of a military academy. Now, this is not like Napoleon's military academy or the Prussians even though later on it was quite advanced and based on some of these ideas. So in his 8th annual address to Congress, Washington basically calls for establishing, and he puts it all in the same sentence, a national university and a military academy. Wow. So it's not just a military academy, it's a national university and a military academy. And of course, like all good things in the beginning of our country, it's up to Alexander Hamilton directly to, and I put that thing on the right because that's just like a third of the document. He writes a letter to the Secretary of War McHenry in 1799, laying out in extraordinary detail exactly what this military academy was to do. Now look at this. This is really phenomenal, right? If you look at, this is just a section on the left. He says the center of this military academy is going to be a fundamental school. That's what he called it. What are we teaching at the fundamental school? Arithmetic, algebra, geometry, the laws of motion, mechanics, geography, topography, surveying, designing structures and landscapes. And oh, by the way, we'll have some military tactics thrown in there. So it's supposed to be a military school, right? School of Engineers and Artillerists. What are they going to learn? Fluxions. What's that? That's the calculus, right? Leibniz's calculus. Conic sections, hydraulics, hydrostatics, pneumatics. We'll have some gunnery thrown in there. You got to know how to shoot a gun. I mean, military. Fortifications, mining, chemistry, mineralogy, fabrication of cannon and other arms. That's important, obviously. And then the principles of construction with particular reference to aqueducts, canals, and bridges. So this is a scientific renaissance conception of an institution, which Hamilton lays out. Now, where is this going to happen? Where is this academy supposed to be placed? Well, during the war, before we had an official alliance with the French after the Battle of Saratoga, a bunch of French engineers coming out of this Colbert tradition, disguised themselves and snuck into the United States, and led by the fellow down on the left there by the name of Duportal. And we had no engineering capability. We knew of certain things, but these guys were experts. The man on the right there is Marquis de Vauban, and anybody that knows anything about military history, fortifications, etc., knows Vauban. They still use his conceptions of defense fortifications today, believe it or not. But he comes directly out of that Colbert tradition. And Duportal, one of the most important fortifications he created was in this little jut of land here, this spur, if you will, which is elevated and it sticks out and it creates this kind of choke point at what we now call West Point. You can see where it is on the map on the right. It's about 50 miles north of New York City. And he designs a fortification there. And since he's there with his French engineers, that becomes the center of kind of what early army engineering during the American War of the Revolution. Now, this doesn't go anywhere. This letter from Hamilton is 1799. Finally, in 1802, the U.S. Military Academy is established. Now, here's something really interesting, right? So, who's the first superintendent of the military academy? General Green, or maybe General Horatio Gates, or some famous military person? No, someone with absolutely no military experience whatsoever. That's the man on the left. His name is Jonathan Williams. He was the great nephew of Benjamin Franklin. He spent a lot of time working with Franklin on scientific experiments. He was involved in procuring arms and whatnot for the American Revolution. He was known more as a scholar and a scientist than anything to do with military. And as soon as this is set up, U.S. Military Academy at West Point, he's the first superintendent. He sets up something called the Military Philosophical Society. Wow, what's this? Well, he's got all the books from his great uncle's library, scientific books, technical books, etc. And he creates what is at that point the largest repository of technical books in the United States. And he invites all the political leaders of the country to be part of this Military Philosophical Society. And the idea is they're going to meet regularly. They're going to discuss the latest ideas of science, technology, military matters, obviously, that's included in this. But look at what his motto is. This is his chosen motto for the West Point Academy. Scientia in bello pax. Now, his translation of that is, science in war is the guarantee of peace. Wow, right? So it's not, you know, stronger guys that guarantee, you know, victory, or, you know, willpower means victory in war. No, that's not. It's idea of science and the guarantee of peace. Very, very interesting. Now, I'm just going to reference this because this is a whole other discussion, but there is, you know, a constant conflict leading into the War of the Rebellion in 1861 between the agrarians, that's Jefferson on the left, his Secretary of Treasury, Gallatin, who they hate Hamilton, that's well known. They hate the idea of having a strong federal government and want to maintain a good old-fashioned Southern plantation life, you know, with the way life should be, and we don't need no government, you know, telling us what to do and all that kind of stuff that ultimately leads to the War of the Rebellion. But you know, although Jefferson is there to create the, I mean, the West Point Academy is set up during his first year of his presidency, but he's not really interested in expanding it. He's interested in using it to purge the military of Federalists and throwing Republicans in and stacking it with Republicans. So as you can see, the quote on the bottom, by 1808, it almost disappears. And you have a group of patriots centered around people like Henry Clay and others who essentially lead the country into the War of 1812. And this is extremely important because the War of 1812 kind of reignites the ideas of the American Revolution and our war with Britain and the whole British system, the British imperial system. And what happens is that because of that war, it's military, right? This allows for an expansion of the entire West Point military academy. The man on the left, Joseph Gardner Swift, is brought in to become the superintendent. He sends the guy on the right there, Colonel Thayer, and along with another guy by the name of William McCree, to France. And they're there for 2 years. Their job is to basically scour the École Polytechnique. Now that had it turned into a military school. Before that, you could see the original name for that was the School of Public Works. School of Public Works, right? So they studied engineering, architecture, bridge building, the whole thing. And Thayer and McCrae are given a budget, and they buy, I forget what it's, something like 100 crates of 1,000 books, volumes, pamphlets, everything you can possibly imagine on the development of the continental science and engineering to date at that point. So you put that together with Williams's Ben Franklin Library, and basically the West Point Library becomes the greatest resource of scientific and engineering literature in the Western world by 1820. I'm going to skip that. So not only do they bring books back, they bring people back. So at the top there is the famous scientist Claudius Crozet. He was a graduate of the École Polytechnique. The West Point also hired the man down on the left there, another École Polytechnique graduate, Simon Bernard, who was an army engineer. You see on the right there, very famous work on descriptive geometry. This was the front end of geometric science, projective geometry and whatnot of the period, and that was written by this guy Crozet. So all of this is being gathered in this little area for this grand project, and that's not all. Across the river, there's West Point, right? There's a pond and a brook that runs down into the river, and there's a big ravine, right? This is a ravine here. And what happens is that Swift and this guy named Gouverneur Kemble, in 1817, they set up something called the West Point Foundry. What's that? Foundry, right? Iron, etc. It's not just that, right? What it is if you look at this diagram here on the left, It's an entire complex to pull together the top scientists, engineers, technical experts from all over the country. This is really Hamiltonian, right? If you know anything about Hamilton's design of the first industrial city of Patterson, very similar here, very similar. And they use the pond here and the water going down, the gravity of the water going down into the Hudson to run a huge mill. The upper right picture, I just happened to have been there a couple weeks ago. You can go there and walk through all this stuff. You can see the ruins. You can see there was a machine shop, molding shop, casting shop, a pattern shop, you know, a blast furnace, etc. So this was the most condensed complex of scientific and industrial technological development, probably anywhere in the world at that point in this such a concentrated area. Now, that wasn't all. So here you have this extraordinary scientific Renaissance school, you know, with all of the greatest ideas of European science to date. You have the ability to produce things, munitions, but also, actually, I just want to read this just to give people a sense of what this foundry was. Go back to that. The foundry was one of the pioneer manufacturing institutions of the country, whose early history, name, and position are indelibly linked with West Point. The institution produced the first steam engine built in this country for practical use, furnished all the castings for the Erie Canal, the water pipes for the Croton Aqueduct for the cities of New York, Boston, and Chicago. In the decades before 1870, it was one of the few places in the nation that combined heavy iron casting, machining, forging work to produce the largest classes of steam engines and industrial equipment, or what economists call capital goods. It could furnish machinery for water-powered mills, blowing engines for blast furnaces, marine engines for river, coastal, lake, and ongoing and ocean-going vessels. It expanded from roughly 60 skilled engineers, craftsmen, and laborers to more than 400, making it one of the largest firms of its kind. And it just also, by the way, produced, for those Civil War buffs, the famous Union Parrott guns, just rifled cannons, which were extremely accurate. They were cast, all of them. That's what the one at the bottom right shows. Those are cannon barrels being bored out. So not only did they have this then, but there was a political operation associated with it to make sure that this whole project succeeded. And they actually set up a newspaper. Swift was involved in this, the superintendent, the former superintendent at that point at West Point. Washington Irving was involved in this, James Fenimore Cooper. The paper was called The Patriot. And here's the statement of purpose of the Patriot newspaper: to encourage the domestic manufacturers of our country to sustain our shipping interests, provide for a system of internal improvements by, that's supposed to be which, our internal trade may be extended and our reliance upon ourselves increased. Finally, to harmonize agricultural, manufacturing, and commercial interests, showing that the whole may be advanced by a system of well-concerted measures. Here's the kicker. Besides political subjects, our press will be devoted to a discriminating defense of American literature. As in politics and in the arts, we would achieve our independence of other countries also in literature. And that's a direct reference to an ongoing British assault on American culture. That's a whole other story, which is absolutely fascinating. But this was associated with West Point, with the military academy. And in fact, Gouverneur Kemble, the founder along with Swift of the West Point Foundry, he would have dinners every week at his house. And Irving would be there, all sorts of people. Basically, James Paulding, the engineer, anybody that was anybody, and they would meet every week at these dinners, at these salons, and basically discuss the creation of the nation. How are we going to build the nation? What's the next project, etc. The big break in all this comes in 1824. And Calhoun is Secretary of War in 1819. Now, this is before he became a kind of crazy Confederate. But he was a fierce patriot before that. And he did his own report on roads and canals, calling for a whole system of roads and canals to be constructed. But the problem is that it was illegal, so to speak, unconstitutional, for the military to be deployed into these local projects. Like, for example, Army had nothing to do with the Erie Canal. It had nothing to do with constructing it. They couldn't. So this was all done by a couple homegrown engineers. And that all changed with Monroe's General Survey Act of 1824. Now look at the language here. The President of the United States is hereby authorized to cause the necessary surveys, plans, and estimates to be made of the routes of such roads and canals as he may deem of national importance in a commercial or military point of view, and hereby authorized to employ 2 or more skillful civil engineers and such officers of the Corps, that's of the Army Corps, of engineers, or who may be detailed to do duty with that Corps as he may think proper. Wow. Right. So the president can say, okay, hey, can we build a canal here? Can we build a road there? Hey, what about this? What about that? And this is like the perfect storm, because following the Monroe presidency, you have John Quincy Adams, who is a real nationalist patriot out to build the nation. In the Congress, you have Henry Clay. He's in the left. On the right, you have the National Bank is revived, Nicholas Biddle. So it's like the perfect storm. It all kind of comes together. And as part of the General Survey Act, they set up the Board of Engineers for Internal Improvements. This is a West Point military operation, the Board of Engineers for Internal Improvements. And it's headed up by Bernard, the fellow that we saw earlier from École Polytechnique from France, and another Army engineer, Joseph Totten, right? Now look at this here. This is very interesting. So they also adjust the curriculum. So they put civil engineering and the science of war. These were 2 separate courses. They're now become one course, a single course, which includes the design of roads, inland navigation, tunneling, railroads, etc. There's a quote on the bottom there by Secretary of War Peter Porter, and he basically says, you know, this West Point Military Academy is scattering the fruits of science, not just to the Army, but to the entire youth of the country. So this is a real scientific, technological revolution, renaissance project to build the nation. And what does it do? Look at this. Between 1824 and 1837, the agrarians, the anti-federalists, succeed in repealing this the General Survey Act. Sorry. But look at what they do in this very brief period. The Board of Engineers for Internal Improvements carried out the survey of 124 internal improvement projects and assisted in the construction of 90 of them. By 1840, the engineering capability had already allowed the United States to build almost 3,000 miles of operating rail. That's 75% more than all of the rail, including Britain and all of Europe. So it's an explosion of development. The map shows roads that were built. Those are in red. Blue is canals. And then starting in the 1830s with the West Point Foundry producing the first locomotive steam engine, the creation of the railroads. So it's absolutely extraordinary. And most of, at least in the Northeast, and by the way, this is this also opens up the entire, what was then the West, we now call the Midwest. So all of these centers of development came out of this, including places like Chicago, et cetera. I won't talk a lot about this. Again, you have a reaction from the populace, from the agrarians. They don't like this. They don't want no fancy army guys coming in and telling us what to do. When Jackson comes in, there's a huge move to shut down West Point. They literally try to shut the entire thing down. you see what Jackson says about the West Point superintendent, Sylvanus Thayer. He's a tyrant, autocrat of the Russians, couldn't exercise more power, and the whole thing was just populist rants. They're spending too much money. I mean, all the garbage that you hear today, about these populist kind of stuff against these types of projects. In any case, the point is none of that worked. And why didn't it work? It didn't work because these internal improvements were extraordinarily popular. I mean, they just completely transformed whole areas of the country that became totally wealthy from nothing. Like the example of the Erie Canal in Buffalo. It's just, an example that people know about. And there's funny stories about this, which we don't have really time to go into, but it's completely Hamiltonian. You look at the report on the bottom. This is from Bernard and Totten's report on building the Morris Canal from New York to the Delaware River. And what do they say? Because people were complaining, this costs too much money. It costs too much money. We don't have the money. So what do they say in the report? They say the revenue from a canal may be much less than that on ordinary investment. And yet the benefits amount to much more as regards to the national economy and advantage. The defective revenue is amply compensated as regards the nation by the greater facility and speed of transportation, thereby making the articles conveyed less costly. The circulation of capital more rapid and a large proportion of the labor of men and animals disposable for the other branches of industry. And also by opening extensive regions to a market, which without this cheap mode of conveyance would be inaccessible. All right, so that's the real conception of what wealth is. And there's fights that go on. Again, we don't have time to go into details. Between these local, state politicians, and you can't spend all this money, and they come in and the always right. They always end up being right. They're very thorough, and they don't care about how much the money it costs. It's got to be done right so that it contributes to, as they say there, the national economy and advantage. So just some of the results of this, the top right there, George Green, again, for you Civil War fans, you know him as the hero of Culp's Hill at Gettysburg. He was an Army engineer. He was the head of the board of engineers for the Croton Aqueduct in New York City that brought fresh water to New York City. On the bottom right is Grenville Dodge, not a West Pointer, but an Army engineer, General Grant's intelligence officer. He ended up surveying during the war the transcontinental railroad routes. And then you had a global operation. This is George Washington Whistler, who's also related to Swift of West Point. He ends up building the first modern railroad in Russia. He, in fact, dies in Russia building this. Army Corps engineers build railroads in Egypt, Central America, South America, Cuba, etc. So this whole thing begins to go global. Important. Now, I kind of want to end on this. What's occurred over the last decades is the work of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche really have brought this whole Leibniz idea of a renaissance of science and technology back to life. And what I would propose as part of this new security architecture is a military collaboration, engineering collaboration between, you see on the lower left there, the Russian engineer troops, the logo there of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and then in 2017, Xi Jinping set up in China the Army Engineering University of the PLA. So wouldn't this be a shift? You get an American military tradition you get the militaries of the three great powers collaborating, not to kill each other, but to build the world, to fight the real enemies, which are, of course, disease, poverty, hunger. And I'll just end on this. You know, this is probably one of the greatest crimes of our era, going back to the death of Kennedy and the beginning of Vietnam. Instead of sending our patriotic young men and women into these horrible, insane, no-win wars, they could be doing what you see on the lower right there. You know, the military could definitely be deployed to build all sorts of projects in the United States and internationally. And that's really what we should be doing. That's the American tradition, not the insanity and the nonsense that you see going on today. So anyway, that's basically what I have in a nutshell, as they say. Oh, you're muted, Diane.
I am muted, but not anymore. Although some people would really like to see me muted. Thank you very much. It really actually just raises a whole bunch of questions. I mean, this number of people were extraordinary, and the international aspect. And I really would ask everyone listening to ask yourself, what do you think the role of the United States should be in the world? Should we be the hated oppressor which tries to crush everybody under our heel? Or the kind of role that we played clearly was intended by John Quincy Adams after the death of Abraham Lincoln under General and then President Grant, a promoter of economic development and poverty eradication worldwide, which is actually how people are liberated. Now, Bob, I have our friend, professional engineer Cal Smith, who I think is sort of appearing there. Cal, you're
part of a bookcase.
I don't know what that is. I didn't do that. I didn't do that.
All right. Well, go ahead. We know you're an engineer, not a Zoom expert.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Bob, that was very interesting. One of the questions that has always that comes up in this period, it's interesting because it wasn't just the Army that was trying to do this. Two of the people you showed there, one, James Fenimore Cooper, who was Army intelligence, was actually a past midshipman and lieutenant in the Navy before he left the Naval Service. And there was an attempt to recreate this at the Naval Academy in the 1840s based on the same curriculum, but it failed. Lynn had told me and Tony Chaikin that one of the problems you had by the 1840s, which comes directly to your question of West Point, was that by the 1840s, Wall Street and the British had, through the administrations, people like Buchanan and Pierce, had begun to organize the Knights of the Golden Dawn and weren't going to let a repeat of this or of what had happened at West Point be repeated in any other institution. But one of the questions that comes up is that in the 1840s, you also have the beginning of what became the split or the recruitment of these people to the Confederate side. Recall that in the Mexican War, the war with Mexico, you had Lee, Grant, Sherman, and many others fighting on the same side, right? They were all fighting together in Mexico. They all knew how each other thought. And this is exactly the kind of situation we're in right now. They all knew each other, but by the 1850s, it wasn't the issue of whatever issue had been developed created a split among this core. And one of the great questions is that the basic material is all there with West Point, which is that the political warfare around the continuing of that institution is really the same fight that we're facing now. We're trying to take up with Diane's campaign. But the question is that we have to make real to the American people why the physical laws that West Point and the Ecole Polytechnique worked, and what happened for people to begin to assume that those laws were not. In other words, by 1860, you had a grouping of people who created a constitution in the Confederacy that outlawed infrastructure. So one of the most interesting periods of this political fight in the 1840s, the 1860s, is how did this happen? It's really the same question that LaRouche took up and what Diane is going to be in the front lines on in the campaign. And I just wondered if he had any ideas on that or had looked at that at all.
Yeah, well, I would I've been thinking a lot about that because I've been doing a lot of work on the Civil War, and it's a fascinating question. But there's two aspects of this that I think are important. Number one, look, this is something that we're still battling today. You have this horrible disease of populism, which ends up degenerating in its worst. Or back then it was the idea of democracy. Democracy, the people decide everything. Of course, the people can be completely stupid and illiterate, but they're supposed to decide everything. And this persisted, and it was a powerful force that nationalists and patriots had to constantly try to counter. That's why I put the thing up there about the American patriot. Had to constantly battle. And this gets to the role of culture, which is why the Cooper question and the Washington Irving question ends up being important. We should do a lot more work on that. But the other aspect of this, which is important to constantly keep in mind, is the British Empire had basically sucked the southern states into their global slave system, and that was a very powerful force. When push came to shove, with the combination of the populism and the fact that you had this, look, 95% of the cotton that was imported into Great Britain in the 1840s and 50s came from the Confederate States. So that was a powerful force, and it was actually much more economically more part of the empire than the British Empire than it was part of the United States. Even though you did have some of these infrastructure projects down there. But I think this question of populism, this is something that we have to really take up. It's a disease, and it's a disease. This is the kind of, in my view, at the core of the bad aspects of the American ideology, because you can't explain it any other way. I mean, why would Robert E. Lee go with Virginia as opposed to sticking with the Union? What's that about? He wasn't a big slave. He wasn't a big proponent of slavery.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think it's actually a deeper problem. I think it's actually a more interesting problem than simply populism. I mean, if you look at the current military leadership that comes out of the Army, they're thoroughly indoctrinated with this British ideology out of Huntington, which says that the perfect military professional has no roots in production and will always yield to what Huntington and his people say is the perfect statesman. So there's the beginning. I think there's a beginning of that in the 1840s and the 1850s, and of course, ironically, a lot of that came out of New York State too. So,
well, I think part of this is a philosophical problem, because what actually makes us human and what is actually powerful is not things or what people consider as power, which is how much money you have or how much force you have. It's actually, I was caused to reflect here recently, the title of Lyndon LaRouche's autobiography is The Power of Reason. What does he mean by that? That the power of any movement, the power of my campaign, for example, is other people's reason. And I cannot stress enough how extraordinary it was that we filed 67,000 signatures to put my name on the ballot in an effort where we did not hire one single professional petitioner through some vending agency as everyone else did. And the people who did that found themselves completely ripped off and frauded because there was no commitment to ideas. Whereas by doing it completely legitimately with supporters of what my campaign represents, the ideas and policies of Lyndon LaRouche, we were able to get on the ballot. Why is that important? Because what really guides an economy? I mean, if you think about just what Bob went through, and it'd be wonderful to take, and next week my husband is going to talk about the Erie Canal. These people had ideas. They actually had an imagination. They had a vision about what the United States would look like 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead, 1,000 years ahead. And that vision is then what shaped their actions. Whereas if you had the world of Locke or the British Empire, you say, well, where you end up is only an aggregation of the particular steps you take piling one thing onto the next to get to some future point, which is also why they could never forecast in the way Lyndon LaRouche was able to. But the way things happen is that you have an idea which then shapes what comes prior to it. And the idea has to be informed by a love of mankind. I mean, clearly the founders, Hamilton in particular, having come from a Caribbean island and having seen the horrors of the sugar plantations and sugar trade, had an absolutely visceral sense of the evil of slavery, slave labor, primitive accumulation, the British method. And he was able to imagine an entire system which would allow people to liberate themselves from that. Because prior to him, this hadn't existed before.
Yeah, that's correct. And the other thing I think is very interesting is that you were able to, the campaign was able to gather those signatures after 100,000 or how many tens of thousands of deaths there were in New York State. And I'm sure many citizens had gone into foxholes. And the fact that the ideas that, as you said, we were able to actually organize that many signatures in a situation where nobody else could have done it, or nobody else did do it.
Right. Yeah, no one could have and no one did.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, it just became everybody else everybody else's campaign is consumer fraud, and it was taken over by consumer fraud, the people they hired to run their consumer fraud. So it becomes they actually are in a very, very weak position.
Right. No, and that's kind of
a weak position. Yes.
That's the position that Schumer is in, which I think he's
That's right.
very much aware of.
Yes, yeah, he's aware of it too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, also the fact that, we're dealing with a world which has had the advantage of 4 or 5 decades of Lynn and Helga LaRouche organizing it. So this is not a small factor.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that some of the founders of West Point, like Crozet was forced to fight for the Confederacy. In fact, there's a town outside of Virginia
Right.
Tech named Crozet, or they call it Crozet, but that was Crozet. Crozet was forced at the point of a gun to build a railroad system for the Confederates, which they couldn't do because their slave labor policy made it impossible for them to train labor to run steel mills. So, of course, the British graciously stepped in and provided them the iron they needed to do that. Anyhow, there's many discussions that could be continued on this. But in terms of the 1840s, it's actually very interesting too, because there was an attempt by Alexander Dallas Bache, who was the grandson of Franklin, to turn now, as you pointed out, as the Army and the Navy's role in nation building became clear, then there was an attempt to build the same institution in the Navy at Annapolis, which was sidetracked by a guy named Bancroft and the whole Wall Street crowd, who nearly succeeded in banning science and engineering from that institution, and the effects today. So this is not a battle that's been settled yet, this would be I think Diane's campaign is a really good way to bring these kinds of issues in.
Yeah, And I mean, one thing that I left out, I mean, that this whole New York Patriot Project with the newspaper, with Cooper and Swift, etc. This is directly at war with Van Buren, who, of course, is the Albany Regency. So this is the beginning of the alliance between Wall Street and the Southern planters.
Well, and also when Jackson made his statement attacking Sylvanus Stare in 1837, that's also the year he pulled the plug on the Third National Bank of the United States, and it began the Panic of 1837.
Right.
So none of the events that you're talking about occurred outside of a vacuum of an overall fight with the British king back, right?
Would you both want to say something about Jackson pulling the plug on the Third National Bank? Because a lot of people are very confused about this.
Can I say something on that? Because I actually looked at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead. It's important.
Jackson, people probably remember that the reason the Third National Bank was in trouble was that there had been a scandal because the cost of specie, transporting the cost of specie to the West Coast was raising was making the price of gold bullion different between the East and the West. Jackson didn't know what to do about that. He was inclined at the beginning of his administration, at least if Bancroft's history records some of his notes, he was inclined to reinstitute the Third Bank, but he didn't know why to do it. And so Bancroft, who was a scion of the Saltonstalls and the Wall Street banks, went to the White House and spent 5 days convincing Jackson that the National Bank of the United States was a plot by aristocrats to take money from the American people and create a landed and moneyed aristocracy, right? And then as soon as Jackson took the bait on that, Bancroft then turned around and was made Secretary of State, created the Naval Academy, took science out of the curriculum, and then the first superintendent of the Naval Academy became the Confederate Naval, the chief of the Confederate Navy Command. So, as Lynn had pointed out over and over again, by the 1830s, Andrew Jackson had become a snarling, nasty old man who had lost much of his moorings, and was manipulated by a deliberate operation that was run out of Wall Street and the City of London to make sure that the Third National Bank would not occur. I'm sure you have more to say too, and I'm sure Diane does.
Bob, go ahead.
No, that's fine. No, I mean that's absolutely right. It was a very concerted attack from London to tear down these Hamiltonian institutions, and they found a willing compatriot in Jackson. The populist movement again, this whole idea of Jacksonian democracy. I mean, this is a phenomenon that swept. There was all sorts of, but you mentioned the Annapolis. They had the same kind of thing at West Point. You had all these calls for, with this, they're teaching culture there and literature. What are they doing? In fact, it's a funny story. The board that oversaw West Point was complaining during the Mexican War that these damn West Point grad don't know anything about war fighting. All they know about is engineering, bridge building, and poetry. What is this bullshit? Pardon me.
Drawing. Yes. Yeah,
But
Sherman
anyway,
was actually a great artist. Sherman actually was a very good artist.
Yeah. So it was an all-out attack with the to not just tear down the National Bank per se, but also these Hamiltonian nation-building institutions. And the Annapolis thing is fascinating because that's something that
Right. We'll also look at what West Point is producing today. Some of the worst neocons are coming out of there. So clearly, that's not
Pompeo.
right. Exactly, and his little
Millie.
ball.
Yeah, Milley, who never worked for commander in chief he couldn't stab in the back. I mean, that's what's.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to wrap up here. So I just ask, I guess, Cal, if you have any thoughts, Bob, and then I'll say a few things.
I didn't hear your last comment. I'm sorry.
Well, no, go ahead. We're going to wrap up. Do you have anything else you want to say?
not right now. I think I think Bob has opened up a potentially good discussion, It should be continued. And I think, I think in terms of your campaign, there's things you could do, visiting places, getting tours. There's a viaduct that ends right in New York City that came down the Hudson River from an old stone dam. The name I forget right now. It was the Corps of Engineers project. There's many ways, I think, that we could use this to educate people on who we actually are and I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, that's exactly I think the point. And because New York State is a funny place, right? On the one hand, it's the Empire States, and on the other hand, it's this center of, this was Hamilton's headquarters, Manhattan, believe it or not. And you have West Point and all sorts of other things that occurred here during the American Revolution. So I think we can use the campaign to organize a renaissance of the American identity, which, by the way, I think is already underway. Which we see from the campaign with the signatures, etc.
Yeah. No, I think people want that. The population wants heavy ideas. They want a purpose for existence, and we need to do these things. I'll just say in closing, going forward, on July 3rd, the Schiller Institute will be holding a conference which will be addressed by Helga Zeppler-Roush and myself on this conception of a new Bretton Woods, a new just Bretton Woods. And that is scheduled around the 4th of July weekend, because the United States, if we lived up to the mission of our founding documents and the fight against the British Empire, would be playing a leading role in organizing for a new just security and development architecture for the planet. And we have to think about that now. Russia is going to win in Ukraine. There is going to be, barring some totally insane move by NATO and the US, which I guess you can't completely rule out, but we have to plan what the peace looks like. Also, the system is coming down. I would like to encourage everyone on Sunday at 5 o'clock, the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, which I had something to do with in creating, will be holding a concert dedicated to peace, a world peace concert. There will be music of Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Spain, I think, China, and America, and it's going to be a wonderful concert, and you can get information on that at the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus website, sinycchorus.com. So come back next week. We're going to talk about the Erie Canal. Also, if this has sparked your interest and your imagination, and you want to embark on some research on any of the people that Bob mentioned or Cal mentioned, and you would like to write an article for the New Federalist paper, please do so, and you can send those in through the website, sareforsenate.com. So thanks very much for listening, and we will see you next week.